Linda Gray has finally broken her silence. For decades, she stood by Larry Hagman's side, on screen and off. She defended him. She laughed with him. She stayed loyal, even when no one else would. But behind the charm, behind the jokes, there was another side to Larry. The side Linda never talked about, until now. And what she's just admitted, about the chaos, the fear, and the truth behind the scenes of Dallas, has left fans stunned. In 1978, Linda Gray was handed the role of a lifetime. Sue Ellen Ewing, the long-suffering, emotionally wounded wife of JR, on a new primetime drama called Dallas. No one knew it yet, but the show was about to explode. And so was the chemistry between Linda and the man who would define her screen life for the next 14 years. Larry Hagman. From the moment they met, something clicked. Not romantically, but energetically. Linda would later describe it as a kind of madness. The way Larry took over a room, the way he made everyone laugh, and the way he left people unsettled. He was brilliant, charismatic, electric, and completely unpredictable. In those early years, Larry was the heartbeat of the Dallas set. Always improvising, always cracking jokes, always larger than life. The cast adored him. The crew couldn't take their eyes off him. And Linda, cast as the woman who would constantly orbit JR's gravitational pull, found herself drawn in too. She learned to ride the waves, to match his energy, to keep up. But beneath the surface, she was already learning something else. That being close to Larry Hagman meant living in his shadow. And that shadow wasn't always safe. In interviews from those first seasons, Linda's face tells a story even when her words don't. She beams beside Larry. She laughs at his jokes. But there's a flicker of something else. Restraint, caution, control. Because what most fans didn't know was that Larry's off-camera behavior often mirrored the chaos he portrayed on screen. The drinking wasn't just part of JR's character, it was real. And it wasn't occasional. Larry was drinking on set, sometimes hiding vodka in water bottles, sometimes slurring lines before the director called action. And Linda? She was the one standing next to him in every scene, trying to hold the show together. She never told anyone. Not the press, not the fans, not even the other cast members at first. She didn't want to damage the show. She didn't want to betray the man she had to work with every day. And in some ways, she understood him. Larry wasn't cruel. He wasn't violent. But he was chaotic. And that chaos had consequences. Linda's role as Sue Ellen mirrored her real-life position more than anyone knew. She was trying to stay composed beside a man who was spiraling, trying to find her own voice while being swallowed by someone else's performance, trying to be professional, even when the cameras stopped rolling and Larry was no longer acting. She once said that being on Dallas felt like a kind of emotional marathon. What she didn't say then, but has hinted at now, is that it wasn't the acting that exhausted her. It was surviving Larry. Still, she never walked away. Not once. Not even when producers knew about the drinking. Not even when it would have been easier to recast, replace, or retreat. Because Linda wasn't just trying to protect her career. She was trying to protect him. The man behind the myth. The friend she hoped was still in there somewhere. But as the years wore on, and the show grew darker, on screen and behind the scenes, that silence would become a weight she could no longer carry. As Dallas soared in ratings, so did Larry Hagman's notoriety. He wasn't just a star, he was the star. And with that power came a kind of invincibility. No one questioned him. No one confronted him. No one dared. But Linda Gray was the one who had to stand beside him. Scene after scene, year after year, while the chaos swirled just out of frame. Larry's drinking, which had once seemed like quirky set behavior, began spiraling into something darker. He was known for showing up to the studio with vodka in a coffee mug, for missing lines, slurring through takes, and making erratic decisions mid-scene that threw everyone off balance. And when the producers called cut, the cast laughed it off, because that's what you did when Larry was in the room. You didn't challenge him. You adjusted. But Linda saw what no one else did. She saw the moments between takes, when Larry's mood would shift without warning, when the laughter would vanish, when his eyes would darken, and the jokes would become cutting, personal, even cruel. He was never violent, never out of control in a physical sense. But he was unpredictable, and that made him dangerous in a different way. He could humiliate someone with a single line. He could freeze a room just by walking into it. And Linda, always the poised one, learned how to read him like a map. She knew when to pull back, when to step in, when to disappear entirely. She wasn't just his co-star. She became his emotional handler. And no one, not the cast, not the crew, not even the writers, knew how much energy she was spending just to keep the show functioning. There were days when she would go home and collapse. Not from the acting, but from the emotional exhaustion of being near him. He could be brilliant one moment, and brutal the next. And through it all, she stayed silent. Why? Because she was raised to be polite. Because in the 1980s, women didn't call out male stars, they adapted. Because she feared that if she spoke out, the network would side with Larry. And because deep down, she still cared about him. It wasn't love. It was something harder to define. A strange mix of loyalty, fear, and a desperate hope that the man underneath the chaos might someday come back. But he never did. Not fully. And as Larry's fame grew, so did the myth around him. The lovable rogue, the set prankster, the man who just liked to have a good time. Only Linda knew how much of that was performance, and how much was pain. She began to resent the way the world worshipped him. Not because she didn't think he was talented, but because she knew the cost. She had lived it, and she knew that behind every magazine cover, every award show, every glowing tribute, was a man who left emotional wreckage wherever he went. For years, she told herself it didn't matter, that the show was worth it, that the audience came first. But now, at 84, she's finally admitting what she never could before. Did matter, cost her more than anyone knew, and she's done pretending otherwise. For years, Linda Gray carried the burden alone. She was the co-star, the confidant, the quiet fixer behind the scenes. And no matter how unpredictable Larry Hagman became, she never let it show on screen. To fans, their chemistry was electric. To producers, it was golden. But to Linda, it was draining. And it was dangerous. Her silence was often mistaken for strength. But the truth is, she stayed silent because she didn't know what else to do. She was trying to protect the show. She was trying to protect Larry. And in doing so, she stopped protecting herself. There were nights she went home from the studio and cried. Nights when she questioned whether she could keep doing this. But the role of Sue Ellen was too important. Not just for her career, but for how women were seen on television. Linda fought for that role. Fought for Sue Ellen's complexity, her trauma, her drinking, her dignity. Ironically, while playing a character unraveling from the emotional abuse of a powerful man, Linda was living her own version of that story just outside the frame. She's admitted, in quiet interviews years later, that the emotional toll of Dallas nearly broke her. The anxiety, the second-guessing, the feeling that she was constantly managing someone who wasn't being held accountable. And what made it harder, what made it almost unbearable, was the fact that no one ever asked if she was okay. They asked if Larry was okay. They asked if the scenes were working. They asked how the ratings were doing. But Linda, she smiled. She nodded. She showed up. And behind that perfect hair, that camera-ready elegance, was a woman holding it all in. Because in 1980s Hollywood, no one wanted the truth. They wanted the story. They wanted the fantasy. And Linda, professional to her core, gave it to them day after day. Still, the cracks began to show. She stopped going to rap parties. She distanced herself from the writers. She began insisting on fewer scenes that made Sue Ellen look weak. Not because she was tired of the role, but because she was tired of feeling that way in real life. Her relationship with Larry became more complicated as the years passed. They still joked. They still hugged. But the warmth started to feel rehearsed. She could no longer separate the man from the performance. And she started to realize, maybe she never could. It wasn't one moment that broke her. It wasn't a fight or a scene or a confrontation. It was the slow erosion of trust. The steady realization that she was pouring everything into someone who couldn't or wouldn't pour anything back. By the early 90s, As Dallas neared its end, Linda was already emotionally gone. Not from the show, but from him. And yet, she still didn't speak. She still showed up. She still smiled for the cameras. Because even then, she wasn't ready to betray him. Even after everything. Even after all the moments that made her question who she was, what she stood for, and why no one else seemed to notice what was happening. But time has a way of surfacing the truth. And eventually, Linda stopped asking whether it was okay to speak. She started asking why she ever thought it wasn't. When Dallas finally ended in 1991, Linda Gray thought she would feel relief. Relief from the grind, from the emotional fatigue, from Larry. But instead, she felt something else entirely, emptiness. After 14 years, the man she had spent nearly every day with, through laughter, chaos, silence, and fear, was suddenly gone from her life. And for all the pain he'd caused her, there was a strange sense of loss too. Because love and resentment in complicated relationships like theirs often live side by side. They didn't speak much after the show wrapped. Larry was still a force in the industry, still beloved, but his body was beginning to betray him. Years of alcohol abuse had caught up with him. In 1995, he underwent a life-saving liver transplant. It was serious, nearly fatal. Linda didn't visit right away. She didn't rush to his side like some imagined she would. She needed time. Time to unpack what those 14 years had done to her. Time to decide whether she even owed him anything anymore. But then, she did go. Quietly, without cameras, without press. And when she saw him, frail, quiet, human, something inside her shifted. He wasn't the JR she remembered. He wasn't the man who stole scenes and shook walls with his laughter. He was tired, and for the first time in decades he looked small. Linda stayed for hours. They didn't talk much about Dallas. They didn't revisit the chaos. She didn't scold him for what he'd put her through, and he didn't apologize. But in that quiet hospital room, surrounded by machines and the soft beep of monitors, they sat with something heavier than words, a kind of understanding. For all his flaws, Larry never hated Linda. In fact, he may have respected her more than anyone else. She was the one who never tried to change him, the one who never exposed him, the one who stayed until she couldn't anymore. Over the years, Linda would continue to show up for Larry. When his cancer returned in the 2000s, she was one of the few who visited regularly. When he passed away in 2012, she grieved privately. She didn't release a long tribute. She didn't give interviews filled with flowery praise. She simply said this: "He was the most unpredictable person I ever knew. He could make you laugh and make you cry, sometimes in the same hour, and I loved him, but it wasn't always easy." And that was all she offered the public. But those close to her say it took years for her to make peace with what Dallas had cost her. Even after his death, she felt haunted by the silence she kept. The way she swallowed her voice to protect a man who, at times, made her feel invisible. And yet, she forgave him, not because he asked, but because she needed to. That forgiveness wasn't loud. It wasn't declared in an interview or written in a memoir. It was quiet, like everything Linda ever did. Graceful, private, resolute. But now, at 84, she's speaking, not to tear Larry down, but to lift herself up. To finally tell the story that had been sitting in her bones for 4 decades. To say what so many women in Hollywood were never allowed to say: "I mattered too, and I'm done being quiet." For most of her life, Linda Gray played the part everyone expected her to. Elegant, gracious, loyal. Even after Dallas ended, she refused to capitalize on the darker parts of her story. No tell-all memoir, no scandalous interviews, just quiet grace. But now, after decades of silence, something has shifted. Linda is speaking not for Larry's legacy, not for the fans, but for herself. In recent interviews and public appearances, she's begun to open up in ways she never has before. And it's not with bitterness, it's with clarity. "I spent a long time thinking my silence was strength," she said in one rare sit-down. "But sometimes silence is fear dressed up as grace." It wasn't just about Larry. It was about what being near someone like Larry did to her sense of self. How she learned to doubt her instincts. How she made herself smaller so the spotlight wouldn't turn into a weapon. How she confused endurance for empowerment. And perhaps most painfully, how she convinced herself that telling the truth would somehow hurt people, when really the silence was what hurt her the most. What makes Linda's story so powerful is not that she's finally telling it. It's that she's doing it at 84. When most would retreat, she's choosing to reveal. And what she's revealing isn't a scandal. It's a cost. She never framed Larry as a villain. She still speaks about his brilliance, his humor, his charm. But now she also names the damage, the emotional strain, the nights when she felt like she was acting off camera more than she was on it. And she's not alone in that feeling. As more women from her generation begin to speak out, quietly, respectfully, about what they endured in silence, Linda has become part of something bigger, a reckoning with the past. Not to destroy it, but to reclaim it. "I didn't want to hurt him," she admitted in a recent podcast appearance. "But I also don't want to disappear from my own story." For Linda, this truth-telling isn't about legacy. It's about honesty. It's about acknowledging the emotional acrobatics she had to perform every day for 14 years, just to keep the peace, just to keep going. She talks about how long it took to trust her own instincts again, how many years she second-guessed every emotion, how the image of Sue Ellen sometimes felt like a costume she couldn't take off, even when the cameras were long gone. Now she's shedding that costume, not in anger, but in truth. Because for Linda Gray, the most radical thing she can do at 84 is be honest. And in that honesty, she's found something she never had during the height of her fame: peace. She no longer needs approval. She no longer needs applause. She just needs to be heard. And for the first time in 40 years, she is. There's a quiet power in Linda Gray's story, not because it's loud, but because it was hidden for so long. For decades, she was the calm in the storm, the woman who held her ground beside one of television's most dominant forces. She played Sue Ellen with elegance and depth, but few realized just how much of that strength was drawn from her real life. Behind the scenes, she was surviving a storm, and no one saw it because she made sure they didn't. Her silence wasn't a weakness. It was a survival skill. And now that she's finally speaking, it's not to point fingers. It's to reclaim her part of the story. She doesn't call Larry Hagman a monster. She doesn't try to rewrite history, but she does name the weight she carried. And she names it without apology. Because for Linda, this isn't about canceling a legacy. It's about telling the truth that coexisted with the legend. The truth of what it was like to stand next to someone who drew all the light, while you quietly held the show together from the shadows. That truth is emotional. It's uncomfortable, and it's overdue. She admits she was afraid, that she doubted herself, that for too long, she let others define what loyalty and grace looked like. But today, at 84, she knows better. She knows that loyalty without boundaries is self-betrayal, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak. Her story isn't just about Larry Hagman. It's about every woman who's ever had to smile through discomfort. Every professional who's been expected to stay quiet for the good of the team. Every person who's held pain in their chest so someone else could shine. By breaking her silence, Linda isn't tearing anything down. She's adding a missing piece. A piece that makes the legacy of Dallas more honest, more human. She still honors the good. She still laughs when she remembers Larry's outrageous antics. But now she also tells the whole truth. About the confusion, about the emotional cost, about the silence she carried for far too long. And maybe, just maybe, there's someone watching this now who recognizes themselves in her story. Someone who stayed too quiet. Someone who put someone else's comfort above their own truth. Someone who's finally ready to speak. To them, Linda Gray says this: you don't owe anyone your silence. Not after everything you've endured. Not after everything you gave. Your story matters, even the parts you never said out loud. Took her 40 years. But Linda finally said it. Not with bitterness, not with rage, but with the grace and clarity that defined her all along. She was more than Sue Ellen, more than the loyal co-star, more than the woman who stayed quiet so the show could go on. She was the one who saw it all and lived to tell the truth. For more of the latest news, check out this video.